Hello, my name is Darcy and today I'll be discussing the concept of colonisation, which is different to my previous concept of identity. We'll be exploring the romanticised view that many Australians still perceive regarding this topic. By drawing upon hidden messages displayed in the artwork by Daniel Boyd, we call them Pirates Out Here, we will discuss what really happened in 1788 when Australia was invaded. Understanding colonisation and the negative impacts that it continues to have on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today is imperative to our society so that steps towards reconciliation can be taken. As you would know, the 26th of January 1788 marks the day that we now call Australia Day. This day signifies when Captain Arthur Phillipps, along with 290 sailors, marines and officials, and 717 convicts arrived at Port Jackson and set anchor in Sydney Cove. It is regarded as the day that Australia was first discovered. However, the problem with this statement is that Australia was simply not discovered on this day, rather it was invaded. The atrocious events to follow this date caused a regional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population of about 8,000 people to decrease to less than half. The significant drop in numbers is due to mass killings, sexual abuse, and the introduction of diseases. From the multiple massacres that took place, an estimated number of 20,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were killed during this period. The history of the struggle for control over Australia between the colonisers and the original inhabitants tends to be written from the perspective of those in power rather than the weak. According to Harris 2003, the names of every convict who died at Sydney Cove has been recorded, and we know all the names of those who died at the hand of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. However, he was unable to find more than a handful of the names of the 20,000 Indigenous people who were killed. Indigenous people who were impacted during this time were simply excluded and ignored from the great triumph and development of Australia. When the Europeans came to Australia, they took the land from Indigenous people, enslaved, raped and killed them, and then would go unpunished as Indigenous people were viewed on a lesser level of human worth. Many government policies such as assimilation, integration, self-determination and multiculturalism were put in place to control their lives in the hope that they could one day wipe out entire language groups and end the Aboriginal problem. This was done by diminishing their cultural and spiritual connections, taking children away from families and placing them into missions and removing their rights to any land. Missions were set up in multiple regions and their main purpose was to civilise, Christianise and educate Indigenous people. European settlers also refused to acknowledge the Indigenous people as original owners of Australia and destructed and displaced their homes. Because of these series of events, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been marginalised and has caused generations to suffer the loss of identity, be victim to racism and are subjected to increased levels of deficit thinking. Daniel Boyd is a Koojala Gangaloo artist from North Queensland who transforms original paintings that adopt a Eurocentric view on Australian history. He likes to appropriate pictures that played an integral part in the advance of Australia so they can be viewed from another perspective. This is demonstrated through his modern rework of the original painting by Emmanuel Phillips Fox. We Call Them Pirates Out Here transforms the proposed idea of the arrival of Europeans in Australia and depicts the situation in a different light. It has been done to make a strong point about what really happened during the colonisation and how it must not be ignored. Captain Cook, who was originally portrayed as heroic and civilised, has now been turned into a pillaging pirate featuring an eye patch and parrot, who is about to possess the land with his Jolly Roger and Union Jack flag. Daniel has also added smoke in the distance to signify that there were already inhabitants of this land. In the original painting, Captain Cook stops settlers from shooting at two Indigenous boys, which portrays him as a moral man who discourages such violence. To display a more accurate image, Daniel replaced the Indigenous boys with shrubs, which are also known as black boys. The valiant act of Captain Cook now has no meaning as it paints a scene where the settlers are simply taking an opportunity to possess Australia. Daniel's illustration of Captain Cook as a pirate and anti-hero represents the traumatic events that are to follow in this nation's history of colonisation. This painting has transformed the original view of Australian colonisation to become a moment of pillage and invasion for the Indigenous people. This presentation has shown that the notion of Australia's colonial past has been romanticised to conform to a white person's perspective. Rather than attempting to exist in harmony with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, British settlers tried to destruct a rich and ancient culture through abuse, murder, possession of the land and enslavement. These actions of the past must not be ignored but should be acknowledged and understood in order to move forward and adopt a sense of mutual belonging for all Australians. Within the classroom, we as educators must use strategies to incorporate knowledge of Australian colonisation within the curriculum. Schools must interact and make connections with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in order to bring in different perspectives to learning and create positive relationships that do not replicate those of the past. When teaching about the history of Australia, it is also important to not start your timeline at 1788, but to educate students about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture before it was disturbed by settlers. I hope you all now have a better understanding of colonisation within Australia, and maybe I have helped to alter your possible romanticised view of Australian history. Thank you.